Claire never built anything. She just lived off what I created.
Tonight, I start over. With someone who actually deserves to be here.
Pierce's voice cut through the applause like a blade. Claire never built anything. She just lived off what I created. 400 people were watching. The ballroom at Capitol Lakes Pavilion glittered under chandeliers packed with investors and journalists who believed every word my husband said. And standing beside him on that stage wearing my dead mother's emerald ring on her finger was Brielle Knox, the woman he had chosen to replace me. Pierce leaned into the microphone and smiled. Tonight, I start over, with someone who actually deserves to be here. The room erupted in applause. I stood near the back, completely still, holding my mother's letter, the one I had finally opened the night before after years of keeping it sealed. What none of them knew, what Pierce never suspected, was that he was standing in my company. If this story is the kind you want more of, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories go up every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. To understand how I ended up standing at the back of that ballroom alone watching my husband announce his new life to a cheering crowd, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of our marriage, but the beginning of everything Pierce built, because those two things are not the same story, even though he spent 15 years pretending they were. My mother, Ruth Bellamy, was a structural engineer at a time when very few women held that title in Madison, Wisconsin. She wasn't the kind of woman who talked about her accomplishments. She just worked quietly, precisely, with the kind of patience that only comes from knowing exactly what you're doing. By the time I was a teenager, she had quietly accumulated more than most people ever will. A decommissioned paper mill on the edge of Lake Mendota, several parcels of land across the county, and a set of patents for a modular housing frame system she had designed herself, structures built to withstand hurricane-force winds, floods, and the kind of weather that was becoming less and less rare. She never showed it off. She drove the same car for 12 years and packed her own lunch every single day. She raised me to understand that what you own is not who you are. What matters is what you do with it. I met Pierce Hawthorne when I was 26, working as an architectural restoration specialist for a firm downtown. He was selling construction materials at the time, charming and relentlessly ambitious, drowning in debt he never mentioned until much later. He had a gift for making you feel like the only person in the room, and I mistook that for depth. When he heard what my mother did for a living, what she had patented, what that old mill represented, his eyes lit up in a way I told myself was passion. I believed him when he said he wanted to build something that mattered, homes that could withstand disasters, affordable and strong, for communities that needed them most. I was the one who helped him write the business plan. I spent weeks at the kitchen table with him, refining the pitch, organizing the financial projections, designing the presentation materials. I introduced him to my mother, vouched for him, sat in the room when he asked her if he could use Bellamy Mill as a headquarters and license her patents for the new company. My mother listened carefully, the way she always did, and agreed, not because she was naive, but because she believed the technology she had spent her life developing deserved to exist in the world, and she trusted my judgment. The company that came from that agreement was named Lakeborne Building Systems, and from its very first day it stood on land my mother owned, inside walls she had built using a system her mind had created. Pierce was given 38% of the company's shares. The rest of the equity structure was something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. At the time, I only knew that my mother had handled it through Wesley Hargrove, the family attorney, and that she seemed satisfied with the arrangement. I didn't ask more questions. I was 28 years old and in love, and I assumed that love was enough to make everything fair. It wasn't. When Lakeborne started to grow, something had to give. Pierce's father suffered a severe stroke in the company's third year, and someone had to manage his care. Pierce couldn't. He had board meetings, Investor calls a company that was finally gaining traction. Our daughter Sadie was born not long after, and the logistics of running a household, coordinating medical appointments, managing the people who helped us, all of it fell to me. I left my job at the restoration firm. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Pierce saw what I was giving up. I told myself a lot of things that turned out not to be true. Over the years, I watched Pierce build a public identity that had no room for the truth. In interviews, he described starting Lakeborn from nothing. He talked about cold calls and sleepless nights and the courage it took to bet on himself. The journalists who profiled him loved it, the self-made man, the visionary CEO, who had turned an idea into an industry. Not once in any of those articles did the name Ruth Bellamy appear. Not once did anyone mention that the land under Lakeborn's headquarters belonged to my mother's estate, or that the core technology Pierce was selling had come from her drafting table, not his. When I tried to bring it up carefully, gently, the way you do when you already sense the response won't be kind, Pierce told me I was being ungrateful. He said my mother had been well compensated. He said I didn't understand the business world. And his mother, Doreen Hawthorne, was always nearby to reinforce the message. Doreen had never liked me. She made that clear in the particular way of women who are too polished to be openly rude. Small comments at dinner, a certain tone when she asked about my little projects, the way she described Pierce's success as entirely self-generated in every conversation, as though I were a guest in a life he had built alone. You should be grateful, Doreen told me once over coffee in her kitchen, in a voice that was almost pleasant. Pierce could have married anyone. He chose you. I smiled and said nothing. I had already learned that silence was the price of keeping the peace. By the time Brielle Knox entered our lives, I had been keeping the peace for so long I had almost forgotten I was doing it. She was introduced as a mergers and acquisitions consultant, brought in to manage negotiations with a private equity firm called Kestrel Peak Equity that was interested in acquiring a stake in Lakeborn. Pierce spoke about her in the clipped, professional tone he used for people he respected, which was its own kind of signal. Within a few months, I noticed that her name came up more than any other consultant's ever had, that Pierce's phone lit up with her messages after 10 o'clock at night, that the business trips he used to describe in detail had become vague, the city and hotel and purpose all suddenly fuzzy. I noticed. I said nothing. I filed it away. Then came the night Pierce brought home a stack of documents and set them on the kitchen counter like they were nothing. He said he needed my signature, a spousal consent form, standard procedure required before Lakeborn could finalize its new investment structure with Kestrel Peak. He said it was routine. He said the deal had to close within the week. He was already loosening his tie when he said it, already moving toward the refrigerator, clearly expecting me to pick up the pen and sign without reading a word. I asked if I could look it over first. The shift in him was immediate. He turned around, and the easy confidence on his face hardened into something else. He said I was being paranoid. He said I was going to cost him the most important deal of his career because I couldn't trust him after 15 years of marriage. He said, and I remember this precisely, that I wouldn't understand the documents, even if I read them, so I was wasting everyone's time. He left the papers on the counter and went upstairs, and I stood in the kitchen alone, listening to the silence of a house that had always been more his than mine. I didn't sign. I photographed every page instead. The next morning, I noticed the emerald ring was gone. My mother had worn that ring every day for as long as I could remember, deep green set in yellow gold, modest and beautiful, in the way that old things sometimes are. When she died, she had left it to me specifically, not as part of the estate, but in a separate note tucked inside an envelope she handed to Wesley during her final weeks. I kept it in a locked compartment in my jewelry box, the kind with a false bottom that you had to know to look for. Pierce knew it existed. I had shown it to him once years ago when we were still the kind of couple who showed each other things. I called the jewelry boutique on State Street, whose receipt I had seen in our shared email account. The woman who answered confirmed that Pierce had brought in an emerald ring earlier that week, not for cleaning, as he had told me, but for resizing. When I asked what size it had been adjusted to, she gave me a number that was not mine. I went back through our joint credit card statements after that, looking with different eyes, a hotel in Chicago, a dinner charged to a restaurant I had never heard of a weekend, I remembered Pierce describing as a solo client retreat. All of it there in plain figures right in front of me for anyone willing to look. I called Wesley Hargrove that afternoon from my car, parked 3 blocks from our house. I told him about the documents. I told him about the ring. I read him the relevant pages I had photographed, and I listened while the line went quiet, in the way it does when a careful man is choosing his words. He told me not to sign anything. He told me to come to his office the next morning and bring everything I had. And then he said something that stayed with me for the rest of that day, that followed me through dinner and bath time, and Sadie's bedtime story, and the long dark hours afterward, when Pierce slept soundly beside me. Wesley said, "Claire, I think there's something about your mother's arrangements that you need to understand. Something she asked me not to explain until the right moment." I drove home telling myself not to assume the worst. I helped Sadie with her homework, made dinner, sat across from Pierce while he talked about a project in Houston. I watched his hands, his eyes, the practiced ease of a man who believed he had already won. And I thought about my mother, about the way she had always planned ahead, always placed her pieces carefully before the game began, always known that the most important things were the ones you protected quietly before anyone thought to take them. I thought about the letter she had left me sitting in the drawer of my nightstand, with her handwriting on the front. "Only open this when someone has made you feel like you have nowhere left to go." I wasn't ready yet, but I was getting close. Wesley's office was on the 4th floor of a building on West Washington Avenue, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and quiet authority. I sat across from him the next morning with my photographs of Pierce's documents spread across his desk, and I watched the expression on his face move through several things before it settled into something I could only describe as controlled alarm. He told me what I had already half suspected: the papers Pierce had wanted me to sign were not a routine spousal consent form. They were a transfer agreement, land patents, voting rights, effectively handing Lakebourne's foundational assets to Kestrel Peak Equity. And at the bottom of a separate filing Pierce had already submitted to the county recorder's office, there was my signature. Neat, confident, dated 3 weeks prior. I had never signed it. Wesley set the page down and looked at me steadily. "He forged it, Claire." Then he told me the rest, that Brielle Knox was not simply a consultant Pierce had hired. She was on Kestrel Peak's payroll, placed inside the negotiation to steer Pierce toward a sale price well below Lakebourne's actual value. The firm intended to acquire the company cheaply, restructure it, and remove Pierce from the CEO position within the first year, citing financial irregularities they had been quietly documenting for months. Brielle had told Pierce he was securing his future. What she hadn't told him was that she was also securing the end of his career. I sat with that for a moment. My husband was betraying me, and the woman helping him do it was simultaneously betraying him. There was something almost architectural about it, layers of deception stacked so carefully that each one held the next in place. Wesley told me we needed to move quickly, but carefully. If I confronted Pierce before we had a complete picture, he could destroy evidence transfer assets or, and this was the part that turned my stomach, take Sadie somewhere I couldn't easily follow. I agreed to wait. I told Pierce I needed a few more days to feel comfortable signing the documents. He accepted that with the patience of a man who was certain he would get what he wanted eventually, and I went home and continued being the wife he thought he knew. Then Doreen called and invited me to tea. She met me at the door of her house in Maple Bluff, wearing a pale blue cardigan and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The tea was already poured when I sat down, which meant she hadn't planned for this to be a conversation. It was a delivery. She slid a folder across the coffee table with the practiced ease of someone returning a library book and told me in that almost pleasant voice of hers that Pierce's attorneys had prepared a settlement. I opened it and read it while she watched me. According to the documents, I was to vacate the house at Black Hawk Ridge within 30 days, make no claim against Lakeborne Building Systems in any form, and agree to Pierce retaining primary custody of Sadie. In exchange, I would receive a modest monthly payment for 6 months, an amount that wouldn't have covered Sadie's school tuition alone. The filing described me as financially dependent, professionally inactive, and emotionally unstable. As evidence of that last point, it cited the sessions I had arranged for Sadie with a child psychologist after she began having trouble sleeping, sessions I had scheduled because I was trying to protect my daughter from the weight of her parents' silence. Pierce had taken that and reframed it as proof that I was the source of the damage. Doreen watched me close the folder and said, "You came into this marriage with nothing, Claire. Pierce gave you everything you have. It would be wise to leave with what's being offered." She added more quietly, "He has the lawyers, the money, and the reputation. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I thanked her for the tea and drove straight to Wesley's office. It was there, sitting in the same chair I had occupied 2 days earlier, that Wesley told me what my mother had never said aloud. Ruth Bellamy had not sold or donated anything to Pierce Hawthorne. The mill, the land, the patents, she had transferred all of it into a legal entity called the Bellamy Family Trust before Lakeborne was ever incorporated. Pierce had been granted 38% of the company's shares, which was the extent of his ownership. A small portion belonged to early investors. The remaining 54%, the majority stake, the controlling interest, the votes that ultimately decided everything, belonged to the Bellamy Family Trust. And I was its sole beneficiary. Wesley let that settle before he continued. My mother had built a protection clause into the trust's governing documents. If Pierce ever attempted to transfer company assets without authorization, falsify any legal filing connected to Lakeborne, or act in a way that materially endangered my interests, the voting rights held by the trust would transfer directly and immediately to me, bypassing every other system. The forged signature had triggered that clause the moment Pierce submitted that filing to the county recorder. I was not Pierce's wife fighting for a share of what he had built. Pierce was a minority shareholder who had spent 15 years running a company that legally belonged to me. I drove home that evening and made Sadie's favorite dinner. I helped her with her math homework, and afterward I told her that sometimes the people we trust most say things that aren't fair, and the important thing is knowing what's true even when no one else is saying it out loud. She nodded seriously, the way 9-year-olds do when they sense a conversation is about more than one thing. 2 days later, the ground shifted again. Wesley called just before noon. Someone had triggered the fire alarm at the private storage facility where he kept physical client files. During the evacuation, a person wearing a fire department uniform had entered the secured document room and taken my mother's file box. The digital backup drive had been physically destroyed. Camera footage showed a dark sedan leaving the parking structure during the alarm, a vehicle that had been seen before in connection with Doreen Hawthorne. The image wasn't conclusive, but it was there. Within hours, Pierce moved on every front simultaneously. Our joint accounts were frozen. My credit cards stopped working. When I arrived at Black Hawk Ridge to pick up more of Sadie's things, the housekeeper met me at the door and told me without meeting my eyes that Mr. Hawthorne had asked me to call ahead before coming to the property. Wesley received a formal letter from Pierce's legal team warning him that continued involvement in what they called internal Lakeborne matters would result in a professional misconduct complaint. I had no documents, no money, no access to my own home, and my attorney was being threatened into silence. Then Wesley called again, his voice carrying a different quality, careful in a new way. He said he had received an anonymous call. A woman's voice, brief and precise, had delivered one message: Brielle Knox was finalizing a personal liability waiver with Kestrel Peak's legal team, a private side agreement that would shield her from consequences once the full scheme became public. She had approximately 48 hours before the documents were signed. After that, she would have no reason to cooperate with anyone. The caller didn't leave her name. What mattered was the information: Brielle wasn't loyal to Pierce. She had been building an exit from the beginning, and she was almost out the door. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed in the smaller room of the rental apartment I had been staying in, the one I had mentally designated as Sadie's for when this was over, and I opened my mother's letter for the first time. The envelope was cream-colored, her handwriting on the front, in the deliberate architectural script she used for everything that mattered. I broke the seal and read. She wrote about the ring, about the trust, about the choices she had made, and why she had made them quietly. She wrote that the most important thing she had ever given me wasn't property or legal standing. It was the knowledge that my right to exist in my own life did not depend on anyone else's permission. And then, at the very end, look under the lining. I turned the envelope over and pressed the bottom seam. It separated cleanly, the way things do when they have been designed to come apart exactly like that. Underneath was a small brass key and a handwritten number, a box number at a bank branch on University Avenue, 2 miles from where I was sitting. The next morning I was at the bank when it opened. Inside the deposit box were 3 things: a second original copy of the Bellamy Family Trust deed, a stock certificate confirming 54% of Lakeborne building systems held in the trust's name, and a small USB drive. I drove back to the apartment and opened the file on my laptop. A video recorded in my mother's living room in the last months of her life, the particular afternoon light coming through the window above her reading chair. She looked directly into the camera and spoke for 11 minutes, describing the history of Lakeborne from the very beginning: the land, the patents, the structure of the trust, the protection clause, and why she had arranged everything the way she had. She said that if I was watching this, something had gone wrong, and she was sorry she hadn't been able to stay long enough to stand beside me while it was corrected. Pierce had managed to steal 1 set of documents. He had not known there was another. The anniversary gala was in 4 days. Pierce had filed for emergency custody of Sadie, claiming I was emotionally volatile and posed a flight risk. A judge, presented with Pierce's carefully constructed narrative and my apparent lack of stable housing or income, had issued a temporary order requiring Sadie to remain with Pierce until a formal hearing could be scheduled. That evening I drove past Black Hawk Ridge and looked up at the 2nd floor. Sadie was standing at her bedroom window. She raised her hand when she saw my car. I raised mine back and I held it there until I had to drive away. I had the deed. I had the certificate. I had my mother's voice on a recording saying everything that had ever been erased. And I had 4 days to walk into a room full of people who believed Pierce Hawthorne had built his empire alone and show them what was actually holding it up. I was not going to waste them. I arrived at Capitol Lakes Pavilion while Pierce was still speaking. I had timed it deliberately, entering through a side corridor, as his voice carried across the ballroom, waiting just inside the door until I could see the full room. The chandeliers were lit, the tables arranged perfectly, 400 people facing the stage where my husband stood at the podium with Brielle beside him, her hand resting on his arm, my mother's emerald ring catching the light. Pierce was telling the crowd that he was starting over, that he had chosen someone who deserved to be there. The applause was already building when I began walking toward the front of the room. Wesley walked beside me. With us came the bank officer who managed the Bellamy Family Trust's accounts and the corporate secretary of Lakebourne's own board of directors. A measured woman named Margaret, who had held that position for 9 years, and who, when I had called her 2 days earlier with the trust deed and stock certificate in hand, had gone very still on the other end of the line before saying simply, "I'll be there." Pierce saw me when I was halfway across the room. His expression moved through surprise and then landed on something harder. He gestured toward the security staff, a brief motion in my direction, and 2 men in dark jackets began moving toward me. Margaret stepped forward before they reached us and announced in a voice that carried further than her size suggested that no one had the authority to remove a controlling shareholder from an official company function. The security staff slowed. The people nearest to us turned. The quiet that started at the edges of the room moved inward like a tide until the entire ballroom had gone still. I walked to the stage. Pierce stood at the podium, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, this man. I had loved this man, I had built a life around this man who had taken the most sacred thing my mother had left me and placed it on another woman's finger in front of everyone who knew his name. He said my name in a warning tone the way he had said it 1,000 times across 15 years of marriage when he wanted me to understand that I was embarrassing him. I stepped up to the microphone. I told them about the Bellamy Family Trust. I told them that the mill Pierce had used as headquarters since Lakebourne's first day belonged to my mother's estate. I told them that the patents underlying every product the company had ever manufactured had been developed by Ruth Bellamy and licensed through the trust, not sold, not donated, not surrendered. I told them that the trust held 54% of Lakebourne's voting shares, that I was its sole beneficiary and controlling authority, and that Pierce's 38% had never been enough to make a single binding decision about the company's future without my consent. I told them about the transfer documents he had submitted to the county recorder's office with a signature that was not mine. I told them about the hotel charges, the jewelry resizing the private arrangement between Brielle Knox and Kestrel Peak Equity that had been running parallel to the official negotiation the entire time. I had asked the venue's audiovisual team to prepare the projection screen before the gala, telling them it was a tribute for the company anniversary. It was in its way. I inserted the USB drive, and my mother's face appeared on the screen behind me, larger than life, sitting in the chair by her window, looking directly into the camera with the calm, precise expression she had worn every day of her life. The room watched Ruth Bellamy explain in her own words and her own voice exactly what she had built and exactly what she had protected. She described the trust structure, the protection clause, and why she had arranged everything the way she had. She said Pierce had been given a real opportunity and a fair share. She said the rest had always belonged to her daughter. When the recording ended, the ballroom was completely silent. Margaret called for an emergency board vote. It lasted less than 4 minutes. With 54% of the voting shares formally transferred to my control under the trust's protection clause, Pierce Hawthorne was suspended from his position as CEO of Lakebourne Building Systems, effective immediately pending a full financial audit and legal review. Pierce gripped the edge of the podium and said I was destroying everything he had worked for. I told him quietly enough that only the people nearest the stage could hear that a person cannot destroy something they own. Brielle moved toward the side exit with the particular walk of someone trying not to appear to be leaving quickly. 2 members of Kestrel Peak's own legal team were already positioned near the doors, and they stopped her with the polite firmness of people who had been expecting exactly this. The firm's representative announced that Brielle had concealed a material conflict of interest, exceeded her authorized mandate, and had been negotiating a personal compensation arrangement outside her contract one Kestrel Peak had not authorized and would not be honoring. The deal with Lakebourne was terminated effective that evening. Brielle understood the arithmetic of her situation immediately. The liability waiver she had been racing to finalize was gone. The payout was gone. The only currency she had left was information, and she began to spend it. She confirmed to Wesley and the Kestrel Peak attorneys that Pierce had known the custody filings contained misrepresented information, that he had specifically asked her to help construct a narrative around my instability as a way of removing me from the property before the acquisition closed. She confirmed that Doreen Hawthorne had arranged the theft of documents from Wesley's storage facility, providing the contact and access information to the person who had entered during the fire alarm. Then she handed Wesley her phone. The messages were still there, sent from Doreen's personal number, preserved, because Brielle had kept them as a precaution from the beginning. Brielle was not confessing out of conscience. She was executing a transaction, trading what she knew for whatever reduction in exposure she could negotiate. The motive didn't change what the information was worth. I walked across the stage to where she was standing. She watched me approach without moving, with the expression of someone who had decided that any reaction was a liability. I reached out and took my mother's ring from her finger. It slid off easily. It had never been sized for me after all, and it had never truly belonged to this moment. I put it on my own hand and felt the familiar weight of it settle into place. I looked at Brielle and said, "You both made the same mistake. You confused my silence with surrender." Then I walked to the side of the room where Doreen stood near the exit, in her ivory dress, her handbag already on her arm, her posture that of a woman who expected to simply leave. One of Wesley's associates was positioned near the door. Doreen found this out when she reached it. We stood facing each other without Pierce between us for the first time in 15 years. She looked at me the way she always had, with the particular contempt of a person who has decided permanently and without appeal that you are beneath consideration. But the tools she had always relied on were gone. Pierce's influence, the threat of financial ruin, the implication that I had nowhere to go, all of it gone in the space of one evening. I told her what I had needed to say for a very long time. I told her that she had used a mother's love to protect a son's dishonesty, and that those two things were not the same as loyalty. I told her that she had sat across from me in her kitchen and told me I had come into my marriage with nothing, and that every word of that sentence was wrong, and she had known it, because otherwise she would not have sent someone to steal the papers that proved it. I told her I didn't need her to understand what I was worth. I had my mother's records, my mother's voice, and my mother's ring, and none of those things had ever required Doreen Hawthorne's approval to exist. She said nothing. Not because she had arrived at any realization, but because there was nothing left to say. The officers who had been waiting outside came in, and Doreen walked out with them, and I watched her go with something that wasn't satisfaction. Exactly, more like the quiet that comes when a sound you've been hearing for so long. You stopped noticing, it finally stops. The weeks that followed were not simple. The emergency custody order was reviewed and overturned when the family court examined Pierce's original filings and found multiple material facts had been misrepresented. The psychologist treating Sadie submitted her own assessment, describing my daughter as a child in a healthy therapeutic relationship, a distinction Pierce's attorneys had deliberately obscured. I picked Sadie up from school on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, and she ran across the parking lot and grabbed me around the waist, and I held on longer than I usually allowed myself in public. Pierce was investigated for forgery, misappropriation of company funds, and fraudulent misrepresentation in the custody proceedings. Doreen faced a separate inquiry related to the storage facility break-in, with Brielle's messages as the central evidence. I appointed an independent management team, commissioned a full financial audit, and redirected Lakebourne away from the luxury development contracts Pierce had been prioritizing back toward what my mother had always intended: affordable, storm-resistant housing for communities that needed it most. I also made sure that every official record and company history credited Ruth Bellamy by name. The land, the patents, the technology, all of it attributed correctly, finally, after 15 years of erasure. 1 year later, Sadie and I were living in a rented house near the university, 2 blocks from a coffee shop she had decided was the best in the city. I had sold the house at Black Hawk Ridge and put the proceeds toward renovating Bellamy Mill's East Wing, which became the Bellamy Rise Center, a facility offering temporary housing, legal advocacy, psychological support, and vocational training for women who had been financially controlled, pushed out of their homes, or simply told by someone they had trusted that they had no right to take up space in their own lives. I designed the interior myself, drawing on the restoration skills I had set aside years ago to hold someone else's life together. It was the first time in 15 years that I had made something with my own hands that I could point to and say, "This is mine." On the morning of the center's opening, Sadie sat at the kitchen table and asked why her grandmother had never told me that I owned the company. I thought about how to answer her. I said that my mother hadn't wanted money to be the thing that defined who I was or what I was worth. She had wanted me to build my life on my own terms, and she had built the safety net so quietly that it was only visible when everything else fell away. Sadie considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to most things and said, "But she made sure you would land." I looked down at my mother's ring. The emerald was the same deep green. It had always been unchanged by everything that had been done with it, everything it had been through. Pierce had used it to show that he could take whatever he wanted from me. Standing here with my daughter at the table and the center opening in 2 hours, and my mother's name restored to every record of everything she had ever built, I understood that he had never actually taken it at all. He had only borrowed it for a while. I opened the door of the Bellamy Rise Center, and the women who had been waiting outside walked in, women who had been told they had no money, no standing, no ground left to stand on. I knew exactly what that felt like. I also knew it wasn't the end of anything. My mother had spent a lifetime making sure of that. And now it was my turn to do the same. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been told that your silence meant you had nothing left, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do that. There are more stories like this one coming, and every one of them belongs to someone who was told they didn't matter. They do. You do.